Okay, so just a last few. I only have three shots left here. Okay, so just to talk about why don't we remember infant amnesia? Why do children, try to think about first before you really get into this, think about what is your first memory and how old were you? So in class, I actually have students write this down. I have them do a timeline of their memories. So, what is your first memory? And what do you remember about it? How old were you? And what are the impressions you have? Be they factual impressions, explicit impressions, or emotional, implicit impressions that you have, that you carry about those first memories. So then, what we typically find is the majority of people, the memories start around 2. I will get people who say that they remember things much before then. So let's talk about why we forget. It's been called infant amnesia for a long time. I believe Freud might have actually said that. And early psychoanalysis believed that it came from trauma and said that we sort of repressed those memories, right? Defense mechanism. Not so much but what is believed anymore. So infant memory, hold on. Implicit memory is available very early on, as we've talked about. Right brain strength at this time facilitates that. But explicit memory relies on more neural maturation. So let's go back for a second, though. So implicit memory, things that happen to us emotionally and so forth, we can recall, and maybe we get gists of those things, of how we felt as a child very early on. But we don't necessarily remember the facts and the specific details, because explicit memory does rely on more neural maturation. So between the ages of 1 to 2, so in the first year we have a lot of implicit memory. Around the ages of 1 to 2, explicit semantic memory, so that's that factual memory. Facts based on experiences, understanding of sequencing of time. So children within this first year they get used to, like, okay, morning, we eat breakfast, this is what I do, and then we eat lunch, this is what, so they can get sort of a sequence of how a day runs. Within, those first, that age of 1 to 2. And they start to talk. So a little bit more. So they can actually begin to narrate and verbalize experiences. So this is brought about by maturation of the medial temporal lobe, which is our explicit memory system. And the hippocampus can be talked about in terms of that lobe. So the more that matures, the greater this ability to use language from our left hemisphere to explain these facts and things that are remembered in space and time, through the hippocampus and the remembering of those things. So that when people talk about memories that they have between age 1 and 2, or potentially even and a little bit younger, it may be that they're able to tell the facts of the situation. What they might be missing is their sense of self in the situation. Which, because we don't get that sense of self really until 18 months old, our episodic memory doesn't really emerge until later, and our autobiographical memory grows over time. So prefrontal cortex development of the orbitofrontal cortex and ongoing development of a sense of self is required for us to really get a sense of, like, where we were, what we were doing, who we were in the situation, what we said, how we felt, rather than just, I went to the zoo, there were bears, we had lunch. Like, I can sequence the day, maybe, but I can't necessarily speak to myself as this little separate person until I get into this 18 months to 2 to 3 years. Memory talk does help this in development along. Children whose parents have them talk about their memories. So when they have, and I don't know if that sounds clear, when they have the children recall, and they can be real imaginative, they can be very elaborate in their descriptions, have richer autobiographical memories of themselves within the situation when they allow the child to tell the story, however the child's going to tell the story. Parents who stress facts and places rather than the child's imagination response have less rich autobiographical memories. And parents who stress the emotional content of memories, how did you feel and what was that like for you, have children with greater knowledge of emotions. So I thought that was interesting. That's an interesting little thing. What do we stress with our children when we have them recall, when we're talking about time spent? Do we recall the facts? Do we recall them within it? and let them tell it so that they build that, or do we express the emotions? And that's what parts of the brain grow, right? That's what repotentiates over and over and over again. All right, so what gets remembered and forgotten? So why do we remember some things and forget others? Sorry, I don't know why this is so weird looking. Experiences with little emotional intensity don't grab focal attention. So remember, for explicit memory, which is the only kind we can really consciously try to recall, it requires focused attention. And so it has to be those things that grab our attention, that will direct them to, that will give consciousness to. Emotional experiences get more of our focused attention. And so they tend to be remembered better. That's the first two lines here. Experiences with little emotional intensity, don't grab it. They're not recalled as easily. Events with more or great emotional intensity get labeled important by like the amygdala, parts of the social brain, and drive focal attention. So if you look back to those first memories, did they tend to be more emotional in some way in nature? I don't know. So stress. What can stress do to our remembering and our forgetting? Moderate amounts can help memory. So that, what happens is that moderate amounts of cortisol and stress hormones can really get, that's those emotional memories that grab our attention. And so emotional experiences are going to have some cortisol and some stress hormones flowing through them, but they also make us sort of really tune into these and recall them over and over. We tend to ruminate or think about them a lot. And so that's going to reactivate those things. So moderate stress, and maybe this, if you've been a little bit stressed and so it's made you study harder or focus harder for a test, can help memory, but that's moderate. And that's a little bit more like, it could be an exciting memory. Chronic stress impairs memory. So chronic release of stress hormones blocks hippocampus functioning. It turns the hippocampus, it doesn't work as well. And remember, if we don't have the hippocampus online, then we do not have this potential to really encode these episodic memories, these episodic or semantic memories. It can lead to, so chronic stress can lead to neuronal death in the hippocampus. So that means just on and on and on, chronic release of these stress hormones. And this is what we see in PTSD patients, that there can be an actual neuronal death. So they have a decreased hippocampal volume. It's smaller. It's lost parts of itself because it's had so much, the stress hormones have damaged it. And it's almost like, we got to have cortisol, and it helps wake us up in the morning. We see activation in it in the morning. It goes and then drops during the day. It helps to regulate digestion and immune function and wakefulness, arousal, and stuff like that. So we need it. But when it's too much and it's chronic and it's all the time, then it's almost like putting too much power into a socket, into a circuit. And it can deaden or even kill. It can deaden our emotional response. It can make it hypervigilant, make it hyperactive, or it can deaden it, and in time it can kill the parts of the hippocampus. It can also, and so if you think about the hippocampus with PTSD, the interesting thing is, so if stress starts to erode the hippocampus or damage it or just keep it from functioning well, remember that it's also about place and time and context. So this is where we see in people with PTSD, the confusion of past events and present events in time and space. So soldiers who might hear a car backfire and recognize it as the sound of guns. The hippocampus isn't working well in its contextual way, in its space and time way, as well as its encoding of information. So chronic stress can also enhance implicit encoding in the amygdala. So then we get too much stress into the amygdala, and it actually enhances and makes it hyperactive. And that's what happens to it. It can grow while the hippocampus shrinks. So when events are overwhelming or traumatic, all right, so This is a different way to think about it. The hippocampus, to encode things in our explicit memory, requires focused attention. Implicit memory does not require focused attention. It comes in through our senses and just encodes itself. We don't even have to be consciously aware of it. It is our unconscious. The right brain is our unconscious, and this is our implicit memory. Non-focal attention encodes implicit elements and not explicit. So if somebody is in a traumatic situation, what might happen is that they focus their attention on non-traumatic elements of the situation. If we think about abuse, they might turn their attention to something non-traumatic within the environment. They don't focus their attention on the traumatic situation that's actually happening. So the details, the specific details, can become not encoded. But the implicit details, the emotional piece of that, the bodily piece of that, does. Stress hormones also in that situation can block the hippocampal encoding. This is why sometimes people who have been through trauma can't remember the details, but they remember the feeling and are run by that feeling in other situations and current situations. It becomes part of their response or reaction systems. Early childhood trauma and maltreatment can impact the structure of the nervous system, the HPA axis, which is that hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, which is a stress hormone highway, and neuroimmune process. And then that can inform the way into adulthood that we respond and react to stress. HPA axis involves release of stress hormones impacting the hippocampus. Chronic stress might produce elevated baseline levels of stress hormones and abnormal daily rhythms of hormone release. So over time for children, that this has become part of their basic architecture and what's laid down in the beginning, that their HPA axis is being laid down at this time through these experiences, then they come into the world with an elevated baseline level of stress, which can be a hyperactive amygdala and maybe a less active hippocampus. Their abnormal, maybe daily rhythms of their hormone release just aren't going to go as they're intended. And so that goes into the basic architecture. And we can see how that can impact memory, stress response, and implicit memory, just daily activity. So here's some things, just final thoughts about memory. Implicit memory drives many of our unconscious, so we talked about that with Freud, classically conditioned behaviors, emotions, perceptions, and stories about life, others, and ourselves. And those can be fabulous and they can be challenging. Explicit memory is our storytelling narrator. It gives us the sequence of events, a sense of ourself in and over time. Memory and its systems holds our stories and ourselves in very real, very meaningful ways. Understanding it is constructed over time, a flowing dynamic river, and not filed somewhere as solid, unchanging stone, gives us greater freedom to engage the process of neuroplasticity to our potential in the creating of our future story and future self. So, I hope that some of this has made sense, and it's given you another lens through which to understand learning, early learning, memory, and how children begin to become themselves, which we will talk more about with attachment and in the ongoing time we have. Thank you.